you have now an entirely separate hidden system of finance that is so totally off the books. It's deeper than the black budget. It is not under any sort of congressional oversight. This is directly under the executive branch and the National Security Council, which, conveniently enough, happens to have people like Allen Dulles, later his brother, Richard Nixon. There's another one that, is going to have their fingers in another player with their fingers in this big financial pie. And typically, the people that have investigated that decision have said that this was to be used as a political slush fund to fund covert operations, which it was. But the problem is the amount of money is so vast that it far exceeds any requirements that the CIA or anybody else would have had for covert operations. So in other words, I genuinely think that most of that money was really for the purpose of funding this covert research. And it does stand to reason in a certain sense, and that is if there was an ancient cosmic war and it involved people that were off the planet, and if they're still out there, they'd want to be, keeping an eye on these monkeys down here, especially, if they just recently got A-bombs and H-bombs, to toss around. So it definitely had an influence. However, I don't think that this accounts for the explosion of technology. And by the same token, I am not one of those people that thinks, well, they had to have had assistance from ET or channeled information. Those claims are certainly out there. I always take the view that is kind of a deus ex machina explanation. What it does is it prevents you from going and looking at possible human avenues. And when he set this up and recruited all the scientists into this Nazi version of DARPA, it was called the Kammlerstab, the Kammler staff. He gave the scientists and technicians absolutely free rein. Didn't impose Nazi Party dogma. He said, this is where we need to be. This is where we want to go. Brainstorm all the necessary steps in the technology tree to get us there and what we have to do. And in addition to this, he set up a privately circulated top secret journal for these scientists to submit their papers to, and circulated this amongst all the scientists. So what he did was basically what we were talking about in the previous section with the breakaway civilization. What he did was he created a cultural climate where these scientists could do what scientists love to do, and that's sit around and brainstorm and do something really wild and cool. And then he comes back, we have to prepare ourselves for enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. Now, the public explanation is that, well, he's talking about the public cover story. They were testing equipment and tactics in Arctic conditions, and the enemy fighters that he's talking about are Soviets. Well, there's a problem, because the Soviets at that time had no aircraft that was capable of literally a hemispheric trip from the South Pole to the North Pole at anything like tremendous speed. So something else is being referenced here. And again, the point is, what would the United States Air Force, and for that matter, the American military leadership, think if all of a sudden they discover something Nazi has crashed in the New Mexico desert 2 years after the war is supposed to be over? Would you hit the panic button? Yeah, you betcha. Would you attempt to cover up the story by saying, oh, it's a weather balloon, it's an extraterrestrial aircraft? Yeah, you betcha you would. You'd obfuscate this story so badly. And for me, I think what von Braun is doing is he's telling us in that statement that the moon is more massive than we were told. Now, if it's more massive, that little rocket in the LEM may not be adequate to get us off the moon. So I think it's another indicator there's an alternative technology in play. Possibly some updated version of the Bell technology. The basic bottom line here is the problem of the standard narrative. Every single detail of the standard he committed suicide in the bunker in Berlin narrative comes from who? Nazis. Mm-hmm. And the problem here is we're being asked to believe a narrative of people that we've been vilifying for 12 years as sociopaths and the penultimate liars. But all of a sudden, when it comes to the death of Hitler, we start believing them. If you look at the Atlantis story, it's a continent that's sunk underwater. Well, where's the one place on planet Earth where you have a continent literally underwater? It's Antarctica.
A mile of ice.
A mile of ice. So what I think is causing all of the hoopla down there is I suspect that they uncovered remains of that civilization, possibly even some of the technology of the civilization, maybe records of some sort. For me, the bottom line is this. If you're dealing with the technology that can engineer the fabric of space-time, and therefore a technology that has the potential of, if weaponized, being something far more destructive than, your standard hydrogen bomb, which is obviously pretty destructive. If you're dealing with a technology like that and you're the elites, you don't want to release that technology until you have the means, the absolute means of making sure that it is not used by people for those purposes. So in other words, you have to wait until what? Until you war? No. You have to wait until you have a global surveillance system in place that can monitor anything like that. Guess what we have? We've got that. I think that they are going to try and use space to impose in some fashion, to impose their global order top down, so to speak, because the bottom up approaches are collapsing. They're not getting them anywhere. This has to be done if they think there is any sort of potential threat to humanity out there. This has to be done. I think there's indicators that they're in a hurry to do this. And I think within that agenda, like all end games, you have several factions now that are vying for being in the position of being the dominant faction when it all comes down. So in other words, it's starting to fall apart because they're starting to fight each other. Predictable, typical human behavior. And they're trying to scramble to keep things tightly under control. I think eventually, within the next possibly 20 years, you're going to see some sort of technological announcements that's going to be the game changer.
Beyond the forbidden.
So they're having to figure out, how to deal with all three of these strategic threats. And it's my thinking that in part the spy satellite was designed not only to keep tabs on the Soviets, but also to try and find out, where this Nazi activity is centered, and also have some means of potentially reconnoitering UFO activity. So it's people like that. Then you also have to look at people like General Ed Lansdale, who's kind of the CIA Pentagon covert operations liaison officer. There's clear indications that General Lansdale was involved with the Kennedy assassination. You have to look at people like that. The final, very crucial thing to bear in mind is, in my thinking, if you're dealing with the UFO problem, these people are going to be thinking in terms of how do we address a potential threat. And they're going to be thinking, well, we're going to have to achieve some sort of technological parity and be able to emulate the performance characteristics of these things. So they're going to set up a secret research project that is going to be kind of like the Manhattan Project during World War II, but it's going to be much longer term, and that means it's going to require much more money over a very prolonged period of time in order to do this. That's going to require a very, very different system of financing. So one of the crucial decisions, I think, that you have to look at is in 1947, President Truman was debriefed by then Major Ed Lansdale on the all that Japanese loot that the Japanese plundered throughout Asia and parts of China during the war. Just an enormous hoard of. Everyone thinks about the Nazis, plundering Europe, and how efficient an operation that was. Well, the Nazis don't have anything over on the Japanese for efficiency and plundering. The Japanese literally sucked up all the liquidity in Asia that they could: bullion, gems, art treasures, you name it. President Truman was briefed on this stockpile of loot by Major Lansdale, and Truman took the decision. This is one of the least known, but I think most important decisions that was made in the immediate aftermath of World War II. President Truman took the decision to recover that loot, but keep it top secret and put it in the hands of the National Security Council to manage. Now, if you paid attention to what I just said, what this means is that in addition to the normal black budget, you have now an entirely separate hidden system of finance that is so totally off the books. It's deeper than the black budget. It is not under any sort of congressional oversight. This is directly under the executive branch and the National Security Council, which, conveniently enough, happens to have people like Allen Dulles, later his brother, Richard Nixon. There's another one that, is going to have their fingers in another player with their fingers in this big financial pie. And typically, the people that have investigated that decision have said that this was to be used as a political slush fund to fund covert operations, which it was. But the problem is the amount of money is so vast that it far exceeds any requirements that the CIA or anybody else would have had for covert operations. So in other words, I genuinely think that most of that money was really for the purpose of funding this covert research. And what that means is also that even if you're dealing with Congress and the black budget and whatever secret projects those are funding, there's a deeper level of black projects that are even more black and therefore probably much more sophisticated than even those being funded by the black budget. So you've created the financial infrastructure for that breakaway civilization. Here's the rub. What you've also just done is you've put the American, a large segment of the American intelligence apparatus into the banking business. Because in order to make this hidden system of finance work, you're going to have the participation of some major prime banks. Now, let me do the flip side of this. In addition to this, something else is going on that I think is highly significant and plays into this breakaway civilization hidden system of finance story. And that's the fact that the Bilderberg group starts its meetings in the 50s. I think it was the 50s, either late 50s or early 50s or late 40s.
Yeah, it was during that time.
I think, it was during this time frame. And if you look at the meetings of the early Bilderberg group, who do you find involved? Well, you have the Rothschilds, obviously. You've got Lawrence and David Rockefeller involved on the Anglo-American side of things. I'm not concerned about them. I'm concerned about who's representing the continent.
Prescott Bush. I thought it was so.
No. Much more significant. On the continent, you have Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands involved in setting this up. And one of the early and consistent attendees at the early Bilderberg meetings is a fellow by the name of Dr. Hermann Josef Ops. Pardon me. ABS, Ops. Why are those two significant? Well, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands was actually a minor German nobleman, and he had a management position in IG Farben during the war. So in other words, this guy is placed. Okay.
Well.
Dr. Hermann Josef Ops emerged as the CEO of Deutsche Bank after the war. But during the war and prior to the war, Dr. Ops ran a handling bank in Berlin, which was the bank of accounts for the Reich government. In other words, it would be like the Federal Bank of New York being the bank of accounts for the U.S. federal government. In other words, this guy is placed. This is the guy that's assigning Adolf Hitler's salary checks as Reichskanzler in Germany. This is the guy signing the check. Okay, so in other words, on the European side, you've got two Nazis representing European interests at the Bilderberg meetings. So if you look at what could be a possible structure in play behind this, what you have is the perfect group of people to access the Nazi loot. After all, these are the guys that will know where some of it is, and be able to launder that into Western banks, which will take their cut, and then they launder it back to Europe in the form of American aid and so on and so forth. So you've got a very clever little loop here of bankers that have their finger in all of this Axis booty that are laundering vast amounts of money. So I think you've created, by the beginning of the first Bilderberg meetings, you've created an international money laundering structure that many of the prime banks of the West are involved in. This will not become evident, these major banks that are doing this activity. This will not become evident until the 2008 bailouts. So in other words, this is a structure that has existed off the books, dealing in money that's almost completely off the books, vast amounts of it. If you've got a secret reserve, imagine what you can do as a banker with your ledgers. It's unbelievable. So yes, I think you've got a structure there, a financial structure that indicates just how seriously this group of people took the UFO problem, how seriously they took the long-term financial commitments that it would require to research and build out the technologies that could emulate the performance characteristics of UFOs. Why emulate it? Well, as far as they're concerned, this represents a threat to humanity. We have to keep this quiet, and we have to build out parity to show that we can do this too, and forestall any potential intervention that they may have been thinking was possible. And, again, whatever their motivations were, I think in that sense they were thinking correctly. They were doing worst case scenario analysis and trying to figure out a way to deal with it. So I think they made essentially the correct decisions, although from a strategic standpoint, although it's obviously had a profound negative effect on our situation today. We're missing trillions of dollars. No one can figure out where it's gone. It obviously hasn't shown up in the public system, because if it had, it would have shown up in the form of massive inflation. So we're dealing with a lot of issues.
All right, Joseph. A while ago, before we get too ahead of ourselves, you were talking about you just said satellite, and of course, we're talking about ancient origins yesterday and human origins. So, what's the deal with this 13,000-year-old Black Knight satellite?
I don't know. I've been trying, I've heard of the story. I've been trying to verify whether or not it's true. There have been consistent rumors, and of course, adding fuel to the flames of speculation is Philip K. Dick, the famous science fiction writer who wrote that novel called Valis, where he as the person that's in the hero of the story, supposedly getting these messages from this ancient satellite in orbit. So, people have been speculating that he may have known something about this Black Knight satellite. The story is supposedly that this was discovered at the beginning of the space age by the Russians and Americans, and they discovered this satellite and knew that it could not be theirs because it was in a polar orbit, and they had not figured out how to do polar orbits at that point in the early 60s. So, which, is part of the story I dispute. I think probably they were doing polar orbits much earlier than they let on, simply for the purpose of spy satellites, obviously. So I'm 6 of one, half dozen of the other on the story. I haven't made up my mind whether I believe it or not, but it does stand to reason in a certain sense. And that is, if there was an ancient cosmic war and it involved people that were off planet, and if they're still out there, they'd want to be, keeping an eye on these monkeys down here, especially, if they just recently got A-bombs and H-bombs to toss around. So, yeah, they'd want something. So it makes sense from that point of view.
Exactly. And so while we're kind of on the space angle, have we already, we're going to get back to the Nazis here in just a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But have we already weaponized space, Joseph?
Oh, absolutely.
And for what purpose or agenda for weaponized space, or why would they weaponize space? Because if an extraterrestrial threat from beyond, just like Ronald Reagan spoke about in his speech, do you think it will be used against the world's population for some dark, sinister depopulation agenda?
Well, anytime, it depends on the weapons you have up there. If you've got grazers, which are gamma ray lasers, or, kinetic weapons, electric railgun type weapons, rod of God technology, sometimes it's called, of sufficient weight that the kinetic energy impacting on Earth would be similar to a nuclear bomb. If you've got that kind of technology up there, then certainly it could be a threat to things down here. I'll tell you why I think that the weaponization of space is already an accomplished fact. And that goes back to the UFO problem. And I detailed this in some of my books, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, Covert Wars and Clash of Civilizations, those 2 books in particular, because I detailed the strange occurrences that occurred in the early 1960s with American communication satellites. We put up a number of communication satellites, and inexplicably, they would die and be presumed lost for several months, and then all of a sudden they'd turn on again. And if you are the national security establishment and you're dealing with UFOs, and in addition to this, you had UFOs buzzing civilian airliners, forcing them to take dramatic emergency avoidance action and so on and so forth. If you're doing this, and at the same time, you've done your post-war studies about creating an international system of finance based on financial clearing, that is done where? Well, it's done in satellites. Our whole financial system right now, everywhere in the globe, is dependent on financial clearing being done by satellites. Well, if you are facing a threat that can potentially interdict those satellites and literally bring the world economy that you're planning to put into place into a standstill, what are you going to do? You're going to protect those assets. Mm-hmm. And it's much easier to protect assets like that with weapons up there in orbit rather than ground-based weapons, particularly at that era. The strongest thing we had in terms of dealing with UFOs at that point were things like lasers and so on. Well, they had not figured out at that point how to get around atmospheric dispersion of directed energy like that. So you're going to put it up in space. And that's exactly what I think happened. I think this has been going on for decades. Now, since we're talking about space, and they're talking about mining the moon, mining asteroids, and so on and so forth, and everybody's going to go out there and do this. Well, again, you're not going to leave that kind of heavy investment unprotected against any potential threat. It's just not going to happen. And I think those that think that they're going to get some sort of international agreement against the weaponization of space put into place are, it's a wonderful idea, all power to you, but I just don't think they're being realistic. It's just not going to happen.
And that's the reason why I wanted to bring it up before we got into the Nazis, because just in case if we ran out of time and I forgot to ask you about it, because it's a very crucial focal point that we need to bring our attention to. I really agree with that. And so let's go ahead and get to Nazi Germany. So Joseph, how did the Nazis get so far technologically compared to the rest of the world? Was it the Thule Society, the Braille Society? Like, what were they tapping into other dimensions? How did this knowledge come to them?
I'm one of those that the Thule Society certainly existed. It certainly had a huge influence on the formation of the Nazi Party and Nazi doctrine. And this is all being mediated by Rudolf Hess, because he was definitely a member of it. That is known. Hitler, on the other hand, everybody says he was a member of it, but he's never been documented to have been a member of any of those societies. There have been claims about it, and none of them have been very well substantiated. But with Hess, we know this to be true. The Thule Society, greeted every member with Heil and victory. The swastika was a prominent logo for the Thule Society. The doctrines of the society became kind of embedded in the Nazi Party ideology. So it definitely had an influence. However, I don't think that this accounts for the explosion of technology. And by the same token, I am not one of those people that thinks, well, they had to have had assistance from ET or channeled information. Those claims are certainly out there. I always take the view that is kind of a deus ex machina explanation. What it does is it prevents you from going and looking at possible human avenues to explain this explosion of technology. And you're right, it was an unbelievable explosion of technology in those 12 years. Absolutely unbelievable. In some of my books, I have a picture of a little klystron tube, a little vacuum tube. It's about as big as the end of your little finger. And this was in use inside of Nazi Germany in 1940. The British and American equivalents of this tube at the end of the war was about 10 times bigger. I have a picture of a big television camera that, the Germans televised the 1936 Olympics. And so you can find these pictures of these big clunky television cameras, 1936 television cameras lining the Olympic Stadium in Berlin, Tempelhof Field. And they're just gigantic. They're these big clunky pieces of equipment. By the end of the war, they had successfully miniaturized television cameras to put in their television guided missiles, by the way, to be about the size of a shoebox. So the miniaturization, and stop and think about that. You can't really do that without what? Transistors.
Yeah.
And so go looking. What else do you find them doing? Well, you find Telefunken in 1940 producing these little silicon chips. Okay, what does that sound like? And of course, this has all been written off to ET in America. Philip Corso, The Day After Roswell, blah blah blah.
And it makes you wonder if Roswell, because some of this is in parallel with the technology you just stated.
Absolutely.
So do you think that Roswell
have you read
was Nazi?
Yeah, I do. Have you read Roswell and the Reich? I wrote a whole book about that. Yeah. I've never been on the ET side of that story. And they give you hints, Corso, the documents that ufology itself refers to, give you hints that the real thing they're concerned about is that there's something Nazi here. But in any case, you've got this explosion of technology. You have the Horton brothers designing these, futuristic flying wings, which, oddly enough, Northrop Grumman built a complete mock-up of one of those Horton brother flying wings about 10 years ago. Spent $250,000 to do this, using the original materials, reproducing the original paints, and so on and so forth. And what they did it for was they were taking radar cross-sections of those things, and they discovered that these things would have been about 75% stealthy to any Allied radar in use at the time. So, so now you can add stealth aircraft to it. You've got supersonic ramjet aircraft, Walter Lippisch and some of those people that were brought over to this country, and stories of the Germans having broken the sound barrier in 1944. You've got Victor Schauberger and Fleissner making their jet turbined, literally flying saucer-like craft. You've got the Nazi Bell. You've got all of these projects.
What exactly was the Nazi Bell?
Well, to me, this was the most interesting wartime project. It was a story that was unearthed by a Polish researcher by the name of Igor Witkowski after the Warsaw Pact collapsed. And this is very crucial for people to understand. It's when the Warsaw Pact collapses and when Germany is reunified that all of these stories come out, because the facilities that were doing this research were in the Eastern Zone. So there's been this explosion of information about all of these Nazi projects because of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. The Bell was a project. It was called the Bell because this thing looked like a bell. And on the inside were two counter-rotating drums into which they put a serum, which they called Serum 525, that was supposedly a kind of a dark cherry red, very heavy liquid goo. And they spun this up mechanically in these counter-rotating drums, and then they pulsed it electrically. And I'm making a very long story very short. I cover all of this in detail in several books. I basically try.
Brotherhood of the Bell is a very good book.
Well, SS Brotherhood of the Bell, Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops, Secrets of the Unified Field, Philosopher's Stone. I've basically attempted to take the story of the Bell and reverse engineer every little detail in it to see what the physics thinking behind it may have been. In essence, what they were trying to do was to replicate, I think, the processes in the sun and to figure out why the standard models of stellar energy really don't work. In other words, they were trying to construct a free energy device. So the Bell is kind of an entry gateway technology that they're testing theories for three different purposes. The first is for energy. Germany, doesn't have petroleum. Germany has lots of coal, but it's not sufficient to Germany's, energy needs. Just remember, Germany right now, today, is the fourth or fifth largest economic power in the world on a population base of about 80 million people. So it's all kind of upside down, has been, since the Kaiser. So they were doing it for that reason. The second reason they were doing it was they were trying to figure out an advanced propulsion technology, an anti-gravity sort of technology. And the Bell, in Witkowski's reconstruction of the story, was seen to have levitated. That's all it did. It just levitated. It didn't do anything else. And the third thing I think they wanted it for was if they could figure out how to access zero-point energy, if they could figure out how to turn it into a field propulsion, that meant that they could also weaponize that same technology. And if you weaponize that, I've said this for years and years, if you weaponize a technology that gives you control of the structure of space-time, potentially you have a weapon that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So this was their most highly classified project during the war. And I believe that, and again, the details here, the devil's in the details. I can't give a Cliff Notes version of this that will sound anything other than stupid and wild and fantastic. It's when you get into the details in the books that you'll see why the case is there. But I believe that the Bell Project went to Latin America and they continued research on certain aspects of it after the war. But it was a fantastic project. So where are they getting all this? To come back around to your question, where are they getting all this? Mm-hmm. Well, I absolutely do not buy any explanation that says that immediately goes to crashed and reverse engineered flying saucers. This is the favorite darling of the ufology community. And as I say, all it does is it prevents people from looking at human accomplishment and human potential to develop these types of technologies. And, my old saw is if ET keeps crashing things on our home world for us to reverse engineer, pretty soon we're going to have to start crashing stuff on their home world so they can catch back up with it. It's an explanation. In other words, it takes you exactly nowhere. So I look at the record of what's actually going on in physics and engineering at the time. And it's when you do that you start seeing some very, very interesting things. The papers of Gabriel Krohn, a Hungarian Jewish electrical engineer, won him a prize for physics in 1935 at the University of Liège in Belgium. And immediately when that paper came out, because what Krohn was saying was, hey, we can take the tensor calculus of Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity and use this mathematical technique to explain why big electrical network systems have anomalies that otherwise we cannot explain. So what Krohn just told you in, cutting through all the verbiage is that with 1930s technology, we can engineer gravity and space-time on the laboratory bench, because he's taking this from general relativity, okay, which, up to that point had no practical use. What's very interesting is immediately when this paper was awarded that prize, all publication inside Nazi Germany of unified field theories in the scientific literature go completely black. No more publication on it. The man put in charge of the Bell Project was a very famous, internationally known physicist by the name of Walter Gerlach. And, everybody says, well, he was put in charge of the German A-bomb project. Well, the problem is Gerlach's specialty in physics were things like spin, particle spin, rotation, gravity, things like this. You don't put that kind of physicist in charge of an A-bomb project. You do put that kind of physicist in charge of a project like the Bell. Okay? So my point is there are enough indicators in the scientific literature, if you look at the personnel inside of Nazi Germany doing all of this research, to give you the clues to reverse engineer a possible theoretical physics basis on which they're doing this. So what happened in Nazi Germany, bottom line, is all of this advanced research was put into the hands of an SS general by the name of Hans Kammler. Kammler set up basically a Nazi version of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. He set it up inside the engineering division of their...
Very brilliant.
It was a very smart... A butcher, let's be very clear, but a very brilliant butcher. He set this up in the engineering, division of the old Skoda works in Pilsen. And that was a brilliant move too, because again, he's disguising it behind a covert corporate front. And when he set this up and recruited all the scientists into this Nazi version of DARPA, it was called the Kammlerstab, the Kammler staff. He gave the scientists and technicians absolutely free rein. didn't impose Nazi Party dogma. He said, this is where we need to be. This is where we want to go. Brainstorm all the necessary steps in the technology tree to get us there and what we have to do. And in addition to this, he set up a privately circulated top secret journal for these scientists to submit their papers to, and circulated this amongst all the scientists. So what he did was basically what we were talking about in the previous section with the breakaway civilization. What he did was he created a cultural climate where these scientists could do what scientists love to do, and that's sit around and brainstorm and do something really wild and cool, and not have to be accountable to anybody should their brainstorms prove to be a failure. So he creates this culture where all of these bizarre ideas get to be circulated, and cross-fertilization, cross-pollination taking place between various areas of inquiry, and so on and so forth. So this is what I think explains this phenomenal explosion of all of these technologies that you see coming out of Nazi Germany during the war. Think of it this way, every modern weapon system that you and I think of as this grand, sophisticated American arsenal, smart bombs, cruise missiles, laser-guided bombs, acoustic homing torpedoes, stealth technology, radar invisibility, over-the-horizon radar, on and on we could go. Every single technology that you think of as being part of this super smart American sophisticated arsenal has a prototypical technology either under development or deployed by the Nazis in World War II. Every single one. That's phenomenal.
Yes, it is. And we were talking about the Nazi Bell. Could the Nazi Bell have been linked possibly to the Foo Fighters? Because it's theorized that the Bell produced this immense form of energy, and the Foo Fighters are said to be very bright in nature. Maybe the Nazis figured a way out to produce many Nazi bells, which could actually be these Foo Fighters.
All right. The bell did give off, according to the stories unearthed by Witkowski. The stories come from concentration camp victims at Gross Rosen, which was the concentration camp that was within a couple of miles of the bell installation where it was being tested. And the stories are that they saw an acorn or bell-shaped device kind of glowing in a pale blue light at night above the tree line. It would come up and that would go back down. The blue light is an indicator of ionization of the atmosphere. The Foo Fighters, I think, there's a standard line out lately, again coming from certain circles in ufology, that just do not want to look at this Nazi technology. If they do, they look at it only in a superficial way. I don't think anybody has gone into the detail with it that I've gone into. And I've done that simply for the purpose of saying, no, you folks need to look at this. This is definitely a big part of the story, and to ignore it, you ignore it at your peril. Every theater in World War II reported seeing these things, and combatants on all sides. They were reported in the Pacific. So I do agree with those people who say that not all of these things could be Nazi technology, because the Japanese did not have anything anywhere close to, what the Nazis were doing. But there are some Foo Fighter incidents that do indicate that the Nazis were up to something, because we have reports of British fighters in France seeing these things start out on the ground in occupied France and then coming up towards the British aircraft at the same time that the Nazis turn off their anti-aircraft. We have similar reports during the American bombing raids on Schweinfurt, where all of a sudden the Luftwaffe is not even attempting to show up and shoot down the bombers, but a few German planes show up and drop these strange pie-shaped things, just very bizarre stuff that gets ignored in the literature. So I do think there's enough of an indication that at least some of these odd occurrences have some sort of basis in German technology. We don't know what. That's the problem. There are a lot of kind of, to be blunt, half-assed explanations out there as to what sort of technology the Nazis may have been deploying. I'm not sold on any of them, to be quite frank, but I do think the indicators are clear enough that they were up to something, and that at least some of these reports have to deal with some sort of technology that we, to this day, we simply don't know. It either disappeared into the belly of the post-war Nazi International, or disappeared into the belly of Russian and American black projects. We simply don't know.
Some theorize, since we're still in the Nazis here, and we're still talking about this, all correlates, it interconnects with each other, with the breakaway civilization, the Nazis, the secret space program, and even Antarctica is what we're going to leave off with today. We'll get to here in a moment. But some theorize that there are Nazis on the moon, and some may call them space Nazis. What's your thoughts on that, Joseph?
Well, I'm very skeptical of it, and I'm skeptical of it on the basis of this Bell story. While they were able to achieve a lot of things, no story of Nazi field propulsion saucers or any of that stuff has any good substantive basis behind it. And in fact, in a book I wrote called Saucers, Swastikas, and Psyops, I point out that most of these stories about Hanabu and Vril and all of this nonsense that you see floating around the ufology community, most of those stories are coming out of a very narrow circle of post-war neo-Nazis in and around Munich in West Germany and Vienna, Austria. This is the place where these stories are originating from. And when you examine the stories, they'll give you pictures of supposed blueprints and so on and so forth. But unlike the Bell story, there are no details of these things. There's no way to reconstruct a putative, or to reverse engineer, if I can use that term, a putative physics or engineering concept behind it. With the Bell story, what intrigued me about that story was, if you read Igor Vitkovsky's presentation of the story, it's full of details, like this substance that they were putting into the Bell, a heavy, liquid, gooey, cherry red substance. Well, the redness right there tells me it's an oxide of some sort. An oxide of what? Well, it's a heavy metallic goo. Well, mercury is a heavy, so it could be a mercury oxide. There's something else going on. So in other words, just on that one little thing alone, you're able, if you do a little research, you're able to reconstruct a potential reverse engineering of just that substance. Why the counter-rotating cylinders and so on and so forth. Why the ceramic metal shell of the device. Why did they build a power plant at the installation to test it? Well, that tells me they're using gobs of direct current electricity. Why the buzzing sound that it made. The Germans called it der Bienenstock, the beehive. Why that buzzing sound? That sound is very typical of an electric gate being open and shut several times per second as it's pulsing electricity into something. It's an arc gate. So there's all of these details in the Bell story that allow you to reconstruct a putative, a potential, a possible physics and engineering explanation of what they were up to. That's completely missing with all of these stories about Hanabu and Vril. All we have with those things are claims of field propulsion, which exceed the actual state of research evidenced in the Bell story. So I'm skeptical of all of these claims that the Nazis or whoever made it to the moon. I'm just very, very skeptical of it. And I know there's people out there arguing for it, but I've yet to be convinced.
What about a link between this Nazi Bell and the ancient Vimanas of India?
It's definitely possible. Because in those texts you have,
they did travel to India also.
Yeah, oh yeah, you've got to remember.
Maybe that's what helped with all this technology that they
Perhaps, but I look at it the other way around. I go back to what I said last night about the ancient elites having to preserve their knowledge in such a fashion that when humanity got back to a similar pitch of scientific development, they would be able to go back and read these texts and look at them in a scientific way. So in other words, I think what's happening is the Nazis are getting their technology from some very astute brainstorming on the basis of the science at hand at the time. And it's on that basis that they're going to the texts and looking at that and saying, oh, maybe that's what they're talking about here. But they're not getting the inspiration from what they're doing from those texts. The inspiration is coming out of this scientific engineering cultural milieu that Kammler and the SS have set up for these projects that allows them to look at those texts. So yeah, they look at those texts, they look at stories of the Vimana and so on, and they're saying, oh, Mercury vortexes, that's what we're doing. You know, so would they then make the effort to gather more information on those texts? Sure, absolutely.
Now, when it comes to this Nazi technology, while we're still on the Nazis, what else do you think that they were possibly working with? Do you think that they were working on maybe tapping into other dimensions, and maybe that's possibly what the Nazi bell was used for, or maybe enormous interstellar spaceships?
I can answer that question very simply by going back to Gabriel Krohn and that paper, which is highly influential. Remember where Gabriel Krohn ends up. He ends up in this country at General Electric as head of their research. Okay. So in other words, yeah, we know what's going on too. You know, this is, you know, but in order for Krohn to say what he had to do, what did he have to do? Well, he's talking in that paper when he's referring to tensor calculus, he's talking about a mathematical technique of analysis that by its very nature is hyperdimensional in character. In other words, he cannot explain his theories without resorting to 4 or more spatial dimensions. He cannot do it. So in other words, the very fact that these people, you know, and I can point you to a very famous German mathematician that's gone down in physics history that was saying essentially the same thing in a different way when he proposed the first post-war unified field theory. He was a famous guy by the name of Theodor Kaluza. And again, the mathematics is hyperdimensional. So is the Bell project where they're playing around with, you know, mercury oxide plasmas and I think probably a thorium isomer in counter-rotating disks. There's your torsion. That's a highly hyperdimensional mathematical idea. Is the Bell device a hyperdimensional object? Absolutely. I want to drill this home. Please hear me, any electrical circuit, the light, the television, the refrigerator, the washing machine, any electrical circuit, according to Krohn, is already a hyperdimensional machine. Any.
Mm-hmm. makes sense.
Yep.
And with this during or actually right after World War II in 1947. Come on, bro. Well, what is it about 1947, Joseph? Because look, Kenneth Arnold sighting.
Yep.
You got Roswell.
Yep.
You got Admiral Byrd with Antarctica.
Yep.
But the most important one of all to me is you have all these things going on. Admiral Byrd, Roswell, Admiral Byrd, Kenneth Arnold sighting. And I'm sure there's a lot of other things I'm just leaving out just to make a point. Then you had the National Security Act of 1947.
Yep.
That's very
suspicious.
Yeah. Very
given the context.
Yeah. So explain a little bit on this, Joseph, and why would they create this National Security Act? Because what are they afraid of? I know some things have to stay secret. As a military, I understand.
Sure.
But it seems like they're really afraid of something.
Yeah, you betcha. Okay. I'm going to ask the listeners to indulge me in a bit of if-then speculation. I'm going to ask the listeners to accept, for the sake of argument, because I don't have time to go through Roswell and the Reich and the case I laid out there, that Roswell was not about ETs, it was about Nazis. I'm just going to ask everybody to accept, for the sake of argument, that what crashed at Roswell was a product of some of this Nazi technology. Now, what does that mean? Let's assume you're the United States Air Force and you come across a bunch of wreckage in the New Mexico desert of something that looks Nazi, okay? And then you bring in your intelligence officer at the local atomic bomb airbase, Jesse Marcel. You have him look at it. You bring this stuff back to the base. Everybody says, oh, that's odd. And then according to the Magic 12 documents, you bring in a bunch of these Nazi scientists that you've got handy and in the area to look at this stuff and say, does this look familiar? Were you guys doing any of this? And some of, oh, yeah, you know, some of that's kind of familiar. And in those Magic 12 documents, let's recall, just since we're talking about ufology, let's recall that some of those documents are describing things like gears. Now, you know, extraterrestrial aircraft, gears? Really? Are you serious? And on we go. All right. The point is, what would the United States Air Force, and for that matter, the American military leadership, think if all of a sudden they discover something Nazi has crashed in the New Mexico desert 2 years after the war is supposed to be over? Would you hit the panic button? Yeah, you betcha. Would you attempt to cover up the story by saying, oh, it's a weather balloon, it's an extraterrestrial aircraft? Yeah, you betcha you would. You'd obfuscate this story so badly. And for me, the killer here is that when ufology argues that this event was an extraterrestrial event, one of the documents that they always point to is the Air Intelligence Collection Memorandum that was drafted after Roswell by Brigadier General Shulgin, Charles Shulgin. And this document does exist, and it exists, incidentally, in two forms, a fake one and a real one, okay? In both versions, this is the killer, in both versions, after you get all of this description of this strange technology, you have Shulgin asking, we need to find out where the heck the Horton brothers are. Well, the Horton brothers were the German aerospace engineers that were designing these big flying wings that I told about earlier. Well, why would you be looking for the Horton brothers if you thought that this was a crashed extraterrestrial aircraft? What would they possibly have to contribute to the thing? Why would you bring in a bunch of Nazi scientists, according to the Magic 12 documents, to look at something that you suspected was extraterrestrial? Why would you show this to your former enemies at all? My reasoning is the Air Force isn't that stupid nor that careless. You know, you simply wouldn't do that. But if you suspected a German origin for it, yeah, you'd bring them in. You'd want to know. So if you suspect it's Nazi, then you're confronted with a problem. Where the heck are these things coming from?
And who's probably didn't come from Germany.
And they probably didn't come from Germany. Germany. Argentina, Chile, those are good places. And guess where the Horton brothers happen to be? They're Argentina.
Yeah, Argentina.
So, yeah, and, you know, all the other strange stuff going on down there. So I think the Roswell story is one of these cases where you have a complete obfuscation of the data, which if you go through the data slowly and carefully and without prejudice to this ET narrative that's got attached to it, you're going to discover that most of the technologies being described are terrestrial in nature. You're going to discover that the reported flight characteristics of this thing certainly fall far short of anything having an interplanetary or interstellar capability. This is my whole problem with the whole narrative. It just does not make sense. other than that, from that point of view.
All right, Joseph.
Yeah.
We were just talking about Chile and Argentina. And so this is getting closer and closer to Antarctica, but we're still with Nazi Germany a little bit. Now, the ultimate question, did Hitler survive World War II?
When I first started doing this Nazi research, I still subscribed to the standard narrative that he committed suicide in the bunker along with Eva Braun, Hitler. I have considerably changed that. I no longer believe the standard narrative. The case, I think, is overwhelming that he made it out of Berlin somehow. Now, there's many different scenarios out there of how he did it. I've got my version. Carter Heydrich has his version, which I think is substantially correct with a few modifications, which became my version. You've got the Gray Wolf version. You've got Jerome Corsi's version. Everybody who's Peter Levenda has yet another version. The basic bottom line here is the problem of the standard narrative. Every single detail of the standard he committed suicide in the bunker in Berlin narrative comes from who? Nazis. And the problem here is we're being asked to believe a narrative of people that we've been vilifying for 12 years as sociopaths and the penultimate liars. But all of a sudden, when it comes to the death of Hitler, we start believing them. This. And my question here is, would you pay out an insurance policy based on that kind of information? Well, answer, no, probably not. So I think the narrative has to, at least to be scrutinized and questioned. I just had today a story that someone emailed me that, conclusive proof Hitler did die in the bunker because a bunch of French DNA experts had examined what are supposedly Hitler's teeth in Moscow and proven conclusively that they are his teeth and therefore he really died in the bunker. Well, this proves nothing. They may very well be his teeth, but there's nothing to prevent the Germans from yanking all of his teeth and planting them around, salting the field and giving the guy a bunch of dentures, hauling him off to Argentina. It proves nothing. And it's getting to the point you can sense a certain amount of desperation. We've got to prove that these people died there, because if they made it out, then the whole narrative's up for grabs again.
Yeah, rewrite history.
You have to rewrite history.
And so if let's say he made it down there, and I like to lean on the side that he did. Now, with Antarctica being pretty close to Argentina and Chile down there, do you think he had possibly connections and ties to, I guess, the continuing of the research that was still going on from Nazi Germany, but maybe they were doing this research in Antarctica?
No. I have never subscribed to the view that there is any sort of Nazi research facility doing these projects in Antarctica, for the very simple reason that, if the Bell is the quintessential project of Nazi Germany and they had to build a power plant in order to test the thing, this rules out Antarctica, because sustaining a research facility of that magnitude in Antarctica would have taxed the Royal Navy, would have taxed the American Navy, let alone the tiny little German Navy, which is also having to conduct wartime operations, in a global war. So logistically, I think this is nonsense to assume that the Nazis had some sort of base like that. I'm not doubting that they had a base of some sort there, but I think it was a much smaller affair than all of this Nazi Antarctic last battalion hysteria. People that subscribe to that, I think, are just not thinking through things. All the indicators, every single indicator, as far as post-war Nazi research is concerned, is pointing the finger directly at two countries in Latin America, Argentina at the top of the list and Brazil, that's where you have to look, because those countries have the technological infrastructure, they've got the power infrastructure, they've got the financial infrastructure to sustain a project like that. And in fact, if you look at Argentina, it's very, very clear that Juan Perón is sponsoring a lot of research projects that are staffed to the gills with these Nazis. Kurt Tank, the Horton brothers, Emile de Wantin, they're all building these advanced Delta Wing jet fighters for Juan Perón.
It makes sense, Joseph, that if this was going on in Argentina or Chile, Brazil, 2 years later after the war, we have Roswell.
We have Roswell, right? Exactly.
And it is said that it did come from the South.
Right, yeah.
Come from the South, not the North or East or West.
Right, exactly.
Very, very fascinating. Very fascinating. And so let's get on to Admiral Byrd.
Okay. You got my book ready.
You got a lot of great research, and you're right about a lot of great things with Admiral Byrd, Antarctica, Rudolf Hess. But what do you think Admiral Byrd meant when he, first off, before I get into that, what sparked your interest in Antarctica? What
all the stories about Nazi survival, the high jump story, and all the stories that have been told about. The latest saw that some people say, well, Admiral Byrd really didn't say that. That's a mistranslation. They're accusing me of this, and I'm not the one that originated the mistranslation. This was out there long before I came along. I just put it in the context of looking at the whole expedition and why, all of a sudden in 1946, the United States decides to send an entire fleet down to Antarctica with a battalion of Marines, incidentally, in tow. And the story that they put out is, well, they realized that the Arctic was going to be a potential area of conflict in any confrontation with the Soviet Union, and we needed to test equipment and tactics. Okay, fine. Why do you have to go all the way to Antarctica to do this? You can do it in Alaska. You can do it in the Canadian North. Those are certainly Arctic conditions. And it's much easier to hand, would have been much less expensive. We spent billions of dollars building the Alcan Highway during World War II to have a land connection to Alaska to be able to supply things up there. So why haul a fleet and a battalion of Marines to Antarctica? This story doesn't wash. I suspect that the reason they did this is that prior to the war, the Nazis mounted a very small expedition by post-war American standards to Antarctica to supposedly explore and map parts of Antarctica that had been previously claimed by Norway. But here's the rub there. The man sponsoring this expedition is none other than Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering. And again, the public explanation is, well, Goering is in charge of Germany's 4-year plans. He realized that they would need lubricants and oils and so on, fishing fields and blah, blah, blah. So Goering is doing this as part of his role as senior German economics minister. Well, I'm sorry, this, again, just doesn't make much sense to me. Hermann Goering doesn't sponsor science projects. This is the guy that created the Luftwaffe and the Gestapo, for crying out loud. So they're looking, it looks to me like they're looking for something, and they're doing it under a guise, a public explanation, to put everybody off the scent of whatever it is they're looking for. I don't know. I suspect the American expedition is somehow in response to this German expedition. And again, Admiral Byrd has a direct connection with that German expedition because the Nazis hauled him over to Germany to give them briefings on what sort of conditions to expect, So you've got a Hermann Goering, Richard Byrd nexus going on here. And if that's not suspicious,
for a hell of a story.
If that's not suspicious enough for you, let me read something to you that dark journalist Daniel List put me onto.
Okay.
This is from a book called The Men on the Sixth Floor.
Lower it down just a little bit. list a little bit more? Okay.
The men on the 6th floor. This is from page 178. Prepare to be dumbfounded. When we began to look a little closer at D. Harold Byrd, nephew of the famous Admiral Byrd, there was one major detail that jumped out at us. It wasn't the fact that he was a staunch right-winger and a personal friend of Lyndon Johnson, nor was it the fact that he founded the Civil Air Patrol in Dallas, Texas, by the way, an organization to which Lee Harvey Oswald once belonged. What intrigued us was the fact that D. Harold Byrd, Dallas millionaire and oil tycoon, was the owner of the Texas School Book Depository building. Gee, nothing funny going on here. I mean, how many coincidences does it take, folks, for people to realize that there's something big going on?
It all interconnects.
And it all interconnects, and everything have something to do with Antarctica and the Kennedy assassination.
Wow.
The American expedition to me is a mystery because Admiral Byrd, he's himself quite a character. And when he mounted this expedition, I put the map of the American expedition in Hess and the Penguins. So there's a map of Antarctica, and the Americans are landing all over the continent.
I'll try to lay that map for the viewers within this video.
Yeah, they're landing all over the continent and kind of trying to work their way inward. But they're landing everywhere but where the Germans did. So, to me, it's very obvious that there's something going on here with that German expedition, with the American expedition, but we to this day don't know what it is.
And so what do you think Admiral Byrd meant when he was known for saying America had to prepare itself from enemy fighters that could fly from pole to pole, or needs to prepare itself from enemy fighters
that fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed.
With what exactly was his warning, Joseph?
Well, that's the problem. And again, they're trying to distract attention from that statement by saying, "Oh, everybody's been mistranslating it. It's not that significant." Well, it is significant, mistranslation or no. He's giving a warning to the country after the Antarctic expedition, which he called, it was outfitted for 8 months. He was there for 8 weeks and he called it off. Now, there's no explanation really as to why he called it off. All of a sudden, it
was right before Roswell.
Right. And let's remember who is in charge of helping plan that expedition. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Secretary of the Navy John Forrestal. That should ring a few bells.
MJ-12.
Yeah, MJ-12. Close friend to who? John Kennedy. Close friend to somebody else.
Prescott.
No. Joseph McCarthy.
Yeah.
That's an odd trio.
It keeps connecting.
Yeah, everything.
God keep connecting there.
Yeah. So Forrestal's involved in the planning of this for 8 months, and Byrd calls it off after about 8 weeks, tucks tail, leaves, gives that interview to a Chilean reporter that's along with the expedition, and that statement only appears in the El Mercurio de Santiago in Chile. So in other words, you can read the Spanish. I put it in Reich of the Black Sun. I put a little picture of the actual article so that you can read it in the original Spanish. And then he comes back, we have to prepare ourselves for enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. Now, the public explanation is that, he's talking about the public cover story. They were testing equipment and tactics in Arctic conditions, and the enemy fighters that he's talking about are Soviets. Well, there's a problem, because the Soviets at that time had no aircraft that was capable of literally a hemispheric trip from the South Pole to the North Pole at anything like tremendous speed. So something else is being referenced here. And again, we don't know what. And of course, you've got the Nazi Last Battalion people that say, he ran into the secret Nazi UFO flying saucer base in Antarctica.
Is that the article you're talking about right there?
El Almirante. Yep, that's it. That's precisely it. Yep, that's the article.
And for everyone watching this, I will place that article. I actually printed it off. I forgot to bring it with me. I will place that article on the video.
Yeah, that's the article. So again, we're left with mysteries here. Why all of this expense and effort and ridiculous explanation to go to Antarctica, outfit an expedition for 8 months, have it end after 8 weeks or so. The admiral comes back, gives that statement, and then he disappears off the radar. Now, after the expedition, he did do one thing. He wrote a 100-plus page article for the National Geographic magazine. And I think part of that was probably a cover story to keep the cover going. His son, as I pointed out in Hess and the Penguins, his son was invited to give a honorary speech on the anniversary of that expedition, and died under very peculiar circumstances prior to that. So something going on with Antarctica. We don't know what. I'm not a believer in Nazi secret flying saucer research centers. I'm even less a believer in Admiral Byrd having found the way into the inside of the hollow earth. Certainly not the ET thing. We simply don't know whatever it was that went on down there. We don't know the full story.
Now, not to get in too much with Rudolf Hess, but you did write about Rudolf Hess.
Oh, yeah.
And the Penguins.
The Penguins.
So just to the audience, give us a little rundown for those that may be unfamiliar with Rudolf Hess.
Rudolf Hess was the Stellvertreter, which is the German term. He was the placeholder. That's literally what it translates to. He was, in other words, Adolf Hitler's personal representative to the Nazi Party and in the Nazi Party after the assumption of power in 1933. This put Hess in an enormously powerful position because Rudolf Hess, in spite of his kind of goofy looks and nutty behavior at the Nuremberg tribunals, Rudolf Hess was probably, along with Hermann Goering, the most educated and intelligent of the Nazi leadership. He was in charge of all the bureaucratic appointments. He was in charge of every liaison office between the Nazi Party and corresponding government offices. He was the High Commissioner for all technological development. So in other words, there was not a project in Nazi Germany that was of any scientific nature that he did not have a finger in the pie. That would have included the expedition to Antarctica. That would have included their A-bomb project, which he was certainly up to his earlobes in. Because you examine what he's telling the British after his capture, it's very clear that a lot of that very secretive correspondence and contact between him and, in some cases, Churchill himself has to deal with the A-bomb. Definitely a crucial figure inside of Nazi Germany. He was so highly placed that he was one of these Nazi leaders that knew the entirety of the German plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union. People have suggested that he even offered the entire order of battle to the British in turn for cessation of the war, and so on and so forth. So in other words, he's hugely, hugely important and probably knew everything there was to know about the Antarctic expedition.
And everybody can just look into my archives and just me and Joseph have talked about Rudolf Hess more in depth with his book, Hess and the Penguins. And if the Nazis infiltrated the U.S. government, Joseph, post-World War II during Operation Paperclip, do you think that there are still Nazis within our government today who believe in Nazi ideologies, who are keeping interest in Antarctica to this day because of the unfinished work that the Nazis had down there in Antarctica during World War II?
That's difficult.
Because you have Buzz Aldrin. I'm not saying Buzz Aldrin's a
right.
Nazi. You have John Kerry. You have
when you look at the people,
Moscow, what's
the Patriarch, Kirill III, when you look at all the people associated with Antarctica, the list is just downright bizarre. Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, the Patriarch of Moscow, the U.S. The U.S. Secretary of State, an Apollo astronaut, King Juan Carlos, another one. The list is just any way you slice it, it's just plain bizarre.
Stinks to me.
This is like a mackerel on a moonlit beach. It both shines and stinks. There's no other way to put it. Something's going on. Are there Nazis in the U.S. government? This is where it gets difficult, because there's no doubt that the post-war penetration of certain branches of the American government by these post-war Nazis was deep and pervasive. Inside of NASA, inside of the U.S. Army missile research, U.S. Air Force, you've got a bunch of Nazis up at Wright-Patterson Air Base, connected, incidentally, with the Air Technical Intelligence Command, which was headed by, guess who? General Nathan Twining, who happened to have been the American general in charge of the American effort at the end of the war to go in and clean out all this Nazi technology.
Part of MJ-12.
And he's part of MJ-12. He was down in New Mexico during the Roswell incident, and on this goes. You've got that. Plus, you've got the CIA and their relationship to Nazi military intelligence. Thank you, General Galen. And if that's a story, how much time do we have?
Oh, we're good.
All right.
Good. 6 more minutes for this segment right here.
6. All right. I'll try and make this quick. General Reinhard Gehlen headed up the German military intelligence operation on the Eastern Front throughout World War II. It was called Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East. At the end of the war, Gehlen took all of his records and he approached the Americans through General Siebert. And ultimately, I think Siebert is directly tied to General Donovan and Alan Dulles in Switzerland. And Gehlen negotiates with the Americans a deal that's just absolutely astounding when you read it. He says, we'll turn over our entire military operation, intelligence operation, to you, because we know that you don't have any on-the-ground intelligence apparatus inside the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc. So you can run it. The only thing I ask is I remain in control of it. You foot the bill, and if any conflict of interest should arise in this deal, we will serve German interests first. And we said, yeah. So what I'm telling you is, when the CIA comes into existence, an American historian, Carl Oglesby, pointed this out. When the CIA came into existence, this meant that our Soviet desk was being staffed by was a house of Nazi spies. And it was so bad, Mike, that Galen's analyses of Soviet capabilities and intentions were oftentimes simply retyped on CIA stationery and handed directly to President Truman without any further input. So in other words, after the war, we have a Nazi general briefing President Truman. Now, is that a situation? Well, it's not strange. It's diabolically clever.
Well, it's a lot of different coincidences that are connecting all together.
And it should give you pause as to, just how accurate were those assessments. And it turns out now that those assessments weren't accurate at all. They were deliberately creating post-war tensions. Now, here's another little thread for you to follow. I was getting to another interesting connection of General Gehlen and his intelligence organization. Now, it's very important for people to understand that Galen's organization was actually rolled into or rolled over and into post-war West German intelligence, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. So in other words, the current German version of the CIA basically is a continuation historically of this wartime Nazi military intelligence unit, okay? Gehlen became the head of German intelligence after World War II, all the way up to the chancellorship of Willy Brandt. So in other words, a very important figure. He was given a banquet on his retirement at CIA headquarters. That's how important, he was regarded. But anyway, in Dallas, Texas, if you research the Kennedy assassination, Peter Dale Scott brought this out. The Texas oil men had some sort of private intelligence network that they were getting intelligence from. This has long been suspected. It was Peter Dale Scott who cracked where that intelligence was. And guess what? It was General Galen's network. So in other words, you have another tie-in to the Kennedy assassination with the Texas oilman, and now West German intelligence, which was Nazi.
Skating, another dot.
Yeah, another dot. There you go.
So, what do you think, Joseph, is down there in Antarctica that is creating all this interest that we were just talking about in the world? Could it be possibly Atlantis? They have technology. Maybe with Atlantis, maybe what else comes with the territory is in the Bible, fallen angels, Nephilim. You never know.
You never know. If you look at the Atlantis story, which of course is coming from Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias, if you look at the Atlantis story, it's a continent that's sunk underwater. Well, where's the one place on planet Earth where you have a continent literally underwater? It's Antarctica.
Mile of ice.
A mile of ice. So what I think is causing all of the hoopla down there is I suspect that they uncovered remains of that civilization, possibly even some of the technology of the civilization, maybe records of some sort. It's increasingly clear that there's indications of this, because you can go online and find stories now where they've uncovered possible Egyptian or Sumerian connections down there, which, blows the mind when you stop and think about it. You've got the Piri Reis map of the Turkish admiral from the late Middle Ages that shows the coastline of Antarctica very clearly and in pretty good accuracy. But the coastline it shows is the coastline under the ice. So, where's that coming from? From a Turkish admiral.
I don't understand how they created that map.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Piri Reis tells you that he did his map based off of other exemplars. And of course, he's a Turkish admiral, so he's got access to all the old East Roman Empire imperial archives that were in Constantinople. That's my suspicion, that he's using very, very old maps that had been handed down, some of them probably from the Library of Alexandria. So again, I think the likelihood of anything being in Antarctica, it's not, pardon me, it's not ETs or anything like that, or secret Nazi UFO bases. What we're really probably looking at are artifacts of a very ancient civilization. Would that be of interest to people like Rudolf Hess? Yeah, you betcha. Yep. Hermann Goering, sure. Admiral Byrd, yeah. John Kerry, Patriarch of Moscow, King Juan Carlos, Buzz Aldrin. Yeah, sure, of course.
Do you think the Nazis, going back to Nazis again, Nazi Germany, do you think that was their interest in Antarctica because maybe that's what helps their surge in technologies, maybe that they actually uncovered something?
Again, possibly, but again, I don't like those explanations because it's the old crashed and reverse engine. It's a reliance on a theory that really turns off the quest to try and explain where they're getting all of this. Mm-hmm. I do think, however, that said, that given certain Nazi leaders' interest in all things esoteric, Rudolf Hess right at the top of the list there, Heinrich Himmler, another one. You'd had Himmler in 1940 establishing an entire department of the SS called the Ahnenerbendienst. And if you read the memo that he decrees the founding of this organization, what he says is that we're going to go out and we're going to look and examine all manner of ancient lore and occult and so on and so forth for its potential military application. That's his exact phrase. And in other words, he's literally telling you, we're looking for Atlantis and we want to see if there's any technology that we can make use of in our glorious quest for world domination. So, yeah, there you go.
Well, Joseph, this is probably our last little segment. We're going to still finish off with Antarctica, but for the next 20 plus minutes now, this is probably where we're going to round it up for the next 20, 30 minutes for this time. And hopefully this is just one out of many voyages that we will get to share together with this information. And you talk about a connection between Admiral Byrd and the Nazis. Explain a little bit more on that.
Well, Admiral Byrd, as I said, was brought over to Nazi Germany prior to the German Antarctic expedition in late 1938. He was brought over to brief the captain of the expedition, a fellow by the name of Alfred Richter, and the scientists that were part of this expedition. So there's that connection. Then, as I pointed out earlier with that book, his nephew ends up owning this Texas School Book Depository. He's in connection and cahoots with, Clint Murchison and Hunt, the big Texas oilmen, and they've got their own intelligence connections.
I just thought there was another.
No, there's no other connection other than that.
Okay. And so let's jump to, because I think that the Antarctica situation, because some say that the reason why the Nazis were so interested in Antarctica, because it is much easier to pass through the Van Allen radiation belt. Let's say if you say the Nazis didn't go to space or the moon, let's undermine that at point. Let's say maybe NASA or just our interest in Antarctica. Maybe our interest is because it's easier to pass through the Van Allen radiation belt. And this is sort of brings us into the secret space program, because maybe the Nazis or whoever are theorized to have had a secret space program.
Well, the idea of a 2-track space program does come from Nazi Germany, because you've got von Braun and Arthur Rudolph and people like that, experimenting with their rockets. And then you have projects like the Bell. You have projects, Victor Schauberger, Fleissner, people that are trying to design these jet-propelled flying saucers, quite literally. So there is kind of a 2-track program in Nazi Germany. And I think this carries over into the United States and its program. You've got 2 tracks. You've got the publicly visible one, and then you've got a much more hidden one that may make use of exotic technologies. So I'm gonna be dancing around on this one, because you're asking several questions here, actually. The Van Allen belts were not discovered during the Nazi period. This was after the war. They were theorized to have existed and then confirmed to have existed by the early space probes. The problem with the Van Allen belts is that they're always cited by the Apollo hoaxers as being the reason we could not have gone to the moon. And I always retort that radiation exposure is a function of the amount of radiation and the time that you're exposed to it.
Yeah.
And it's conceivable that you can get through them fast enough to reduce the exposure, or, as you pointed out, you can go through the hole at the poles. Okay, that's a much more difficult maneuver. But there's a third possibility, and this possibility goes right back to the Bell. So let me try and set this up very carefully. And I'm not going to go into all the reverse engineering details. The devil's in the details. You got to read the books for this to make sense. But let's go back to that serum that's inside the Bell. In my speculation, and I want to emphasize speculation, I think that this was probably a mercury thorium oxide compound, with thorium being in an isomer form. An isomer is a form of isotope where the nucleus of the atom is in a high state of spin. When you slow it down, if you stop it or suddenly slow it down, that isomer will spit out gobs of gamma radiation. Okay. Thorium-229 isomer happens to be an isomer where the threshold of stability is very low. In other words, it's very easy to stop it. Okay. That's why I think they're pulsing this stuff. Okay. With that high voltage electricity. So you've got a plasma-inducing substance that you're twirling around inside the bell, that you're pulsing with gobs of direct current electricity. Why? Why are you doing this? Well, one of the things that I think they're doing is a radioactive isotope has a predictable and fairly regular decay rate.
Yeah.
So that if you want to measure any time dilation effects that are occurring because of all of the spin and other things you're doing to this stuff, the way you're going to do it, the way you're going to measure that time dilation effect is precisely through use of a radioactive isotope by slowing it down or speeding up the rate of decay. Now, that sounds totally foreign to the physics that most people have learned because they've been taught that these rates of decay are constant. Well, they're not. So that's what I think they're doing. In other words, this is both a fuel for the device and it's a way of measuring the effect that they're getting in the device. Now, it so happens that Igor Vitkovsky tells the story about the bell when it was first tested, having killed 60-some people, including some of the scientists involved in the testing of the device, because it was spitting out gobs of radiation. That's the clue that told me you're dealing with an isomer, okay?
Yeah.
What this means is if you can learn to control the rate of decay or even to create a kind of an electromagnetic bubble around something like this, you could slow down or speed up exposure to radiation. So I suspect that the Apollo missions occurred with the secret aid of a technology that we have not been told about that were present in the Apollo missions for that reason and for another reason. The other reason is if you look at the LEM, Lunar Excursion Module, that lands on the moon, and then look at those films of the LEMs taking off in the late Apollo missions from the moon, what do you see? Well, it just kind of pops up and up it goes.
Almost like it's in the studio.
Yeah, almost like, jerk the string, pull it up. Okay. And, you know, the Apollo hoaxer explanation is, well, Stanley Kubrick was doing all of this through front screening and all of this stuff. And somewhere in London. And, you know, there's another little signature that Kubrick is giving you that this isn't really happening. I take the opposite view. What you're seeing there is actual footage, and it's an important clue that there's an alternative technology in play getting us off the moon. Why? Because a rocket accelerates, you know, geometrically. Right? Well, no, a rocket accelerates. It doesn't just pop up at a constant velocity. It starts out slow, and then per unit of time travels a little further per each unit of time. So it starts out slow and it accelerates. So in other words, the signature of a rocket isn't present in that footage. You're watching something else. You're watching an alternative technology. Now, the reason I say that is that Wernher von Braun, about 3 or 4 weeks after the first Apollo landing, which incidentally, folks, took place on July 20th, 1969, the 25th anniversary of the failed bomb plot against Adolf Hitler. The eagle has landed. I think Wernher von Braun let out a very important clue. He gave an interview for Time magazine, and I remember reading this as a boy. It was on a little box at the bottom of the page of the article in Time magazine. And von Braun stated that the equigravisphere, in other words, the neutral point of gravitational attraction between the Earth and the Moon, had occurred at about 43,500 miles from the surface of the Moon. And that was an important slip because shortly after he gave that article, all of a sudden he was forced to resign from NASA and went to work for Fairchild Industries. Bang. You know, the guy that supposedly got us to the moon all of a sudden resigns. I think what von Braun is doing is he's telling us in that statement that the moon is more massive than we were told. Now, if it's more massive, that little rocket in the LEM may not be adequate to get us off the moon. So I think it's another indicator there's an alternative technology in play. Possibly some updated version of the Bell technology. Another point to consider. The LEM, when you listen to the transmissions from the LEM as it's taking off, well, those astronauts are supposedly sitting right on top of a rocket engine. It's kind of like a rocket engine in a cab over semi truck, okay? Where you're literally sitting on top of the diesel in those cab overs. Well, you're doing the same thing with that little rocket engine. That's going to make a lot of noise inside that cab. Yet you're not hearing a lot of noise, okay? So all the signatures are pointing to me to some sort of alternative technology. Now, here's the clincher. If you look at von Braun, I put this picture in several of the Nazi books. He's sometimes seen in company with one of his good friends, a fellow by the name of Dr. Kurt Debus, D-E-B-U-S, Debus. Debus was one of these paperclip Nazis. Debus was, at the time of the Apollo flights, get this, he was the senior flight administrator for the Apollo program, a Nazi, okay? And a real Nazi, because it just so happens that Kurt Debus was, his file, his security vetting file, was reopened in 1947 after Roswell, when it became known that the paperclip Nazis there in Texas and New Mexico had dead drops inside of Mexico, were getting money from somewhere to afford their Mercedes cars, which were far beyond the salary they were being paid by the U.S. government, and that they had some sort of command structure or connection to something that they had no idea about. So they reopened his security vetting. This guy ends up as the senior flight administrator for Apollo. Now, here's the clincher. Debus was not a rocket scientist. His specialty was high voltage direct current measurement and plasmas. In 1942, in Germany, he was working for the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft on some sort of secret project involving plasma, which was connected with the Bell, because that's the German company that was building the Bell. So this guy has a direct connection to the Nazi Bell technology. So it's looking to me like NASA made some sort of trade-off with these Nazis to get its hands on some of that technology, use it in the Apollo missions, to get them to the moon, and much more importantly, probably off the moon, which, that was Kennedy's directive. And Debus, just to sweeten the pot a little bit more, Debus, after the Apollo era, ends up being in charge of NASA's UFO desk, a Nazi, let us remember. And after he retires from NASA, he goes to work for a West German firm called OTRAG, Orbital Transport-Raketen Aktiengesellschaft, which had an Area 51-like compound on 250, I think 25 or 250,000 square miles in the Congo in Africa, which was building cruise missiles, testing biological weapons, and so on. Oh, yeah. Well, you can thank Mikhail Gorbachev for that little nugget of information. Yeah, but Davis was connected with that West German Area 51 thing going on in the Congo and Africa. So this guy clearly has his fingers in all these pies, and I think he ends up as senior flight administrator for the Apollo missions precisely because he worked on this technology, and he may have been the point man, for negotiating my speculated deal. What was the deal? Well, I think probably it was this. We'll give you access to this technology. You give us access to whatever you find up there. Uh-huh.
And while we're on NASA, why are they keeping the real secret space program, why are they keeping the real space program secret, aka the secret space program? Because we all know that NASA hasn't really done anything since 1975.
Yeah, ain't that peculiar? Uh-huh. ain't that peculiar. We can't seem to design a big heavy lift booster without without our German scientists. I think there's several reasons for keeping it secret. For me, the bottom line is this: if you're dealing with a technology that can engineer the fabric of space-time, and therefore a technology that has the potential of, if weaponized, being something far more destructive than, your standard hydrogen bomb, which is obviously pretty destructive. If you're dealing with a technology like that and you're the elites, you don't want to release that technology until you have the means, the absolute means of making sure that it is not used by people for those purposes. So in other words, you have to wait until what? Until you
war.
No. You have to wait until you have a global surveillance system in place that can monitor anything like that. Guess what we have? We've got that. Guess what's happening? There's more and more stories now coming out from Lockheed. This is not fringe alternative.
Who is also down in Antarctica too.
Yeah, Lockheed's down in Antarctica. They've come out with their little small fusion engine. NASA's talking about testing the EM drive engine, and they're doing that. So in other words, now they're releasing these stories because they've got the means of monitoring the potential proliferation of the technology and making sure that it's not being falling into the wrong hands. I think this is really the reason that Morgan suppressed Tesla, because the realization that even back then was this stuff is very, very dangerous. We don't want it falling into the wrong hands, and we have no way of monitoring this. And if you understand, some of the basic simple principles behind it, it's very easy to do. So they have to sit on this technology until they've got the means to prevent proliferation. Think of the problems with nuclear proliferation now, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and so on. Think of the problems of nuclear proliferation now, where you're concerned about the wrong type of regime getting a hold of the atomic bomb, or God forbid, even worse, the hydrogen bomb, and magnify that by several orders of magnitude with a completely different technology that's capable of potentially much more destruction with no radioactive fallout to come back on the user of the technology. That's a proliferation nightmare. That's what they were confronted with.
So, to this technology, Joseph, why are they building these enormous, conspicuous spaceships? Because are they building them to be created to mine for resources in space, for carrying huge amounts of cargo for this breakaway civilization that Richard Dolan, you, and many others talked about?
Well, I don't know what big, huge spaceships you're referring to. If you're referring to rockets, Bigelow, Elon Musk, people like that, and the private space,
37B, I guess.
Yes, those things. Bottom line here, folks, chemical rockets.
Because I'm sorry, I feel like they are doing this behind the scenes in this secret space program somewhere here on Earth. Sure. I'm sure they are creating these huge spaceships to go interstellar travel.
Well, maybe I can answer your question in a slightly different way. Let's look at the typical ufology explanation for these big triangular things that people have seen, sometimes a mile, Well, obviously human beings can't build anything that big and get it up there. Ever hear of the Hindenburg?
Mm-hmm.
As big as the Empire State Building?
Yeah.
With an enormous lift capability. Now, let's stop and just pretend we're engineers with gobs of money to spend. And we have huge hangars, like in Seattle. Could you build a collapsible wire frame, fill it with gas, like a balloon, expand it, have it unfold, put dielectrics on the surface and leading edges of this thing, charge those leading edges with a lot of electricity to move it around using electrical steering and so on, using a gas, an inert gas, not hydrogen, for your lift capability. Could you do that? Sure. Absolutely. So I don't buy it's too big for humans to build. That's a non-starter as an explanation. Could we do something like that? Sure, absolutely. You can go online and look at patents from the Army, from the Air Force, from DARPA for doing precisely what I've just told you.
Too big for humans to build, but it was. I don't want to get into Egypt, but they say humans built the pyramid.
Yeah,
That's
somehow.
That's okay though.
That's okay. Yeah. So I think, all the indicators are, to me, that they're doing something behind the scenes. And the idea of using chemical rockets to go out and mine asteroids, I'm sorry, this is not practical. When they're telling you that we're going to go out and mine the moon, mine Mars, and mine asteroids, when they're saying this and they're deadly serious about it, the flip side of that is they're telling you we're getting close, if not already possess the technology to do that, and it ain't chemical rockets with 3 men and a tiny little capsule on the top of it that are going to go do that.
Yeah.
They've shown pictures of these enormous buckets, satellite buckets with rockets going out there to mine things. And again, I just laugh when I look at this. Rockets ain't going to do this job, folks.
No. Is there any evidence that where these spaceships for the secret space program may be created, maybe Area 51, other places across the world?
Well, you're going to want to build them in facilities where you're not going to attract a lot of attention, and then you're going to have to launch them in places and times where you're not going to get a lot of attention. So I'm thinking underground facilities or remote areas, Antarctica, the middle of Africa, and the jungles of the Congo, Amazon basin, places where, unless you have satellite technology and access to things like that, you're not going to be going to be caught doing it. So those are the places I would look at. And Lockheed Martin's presence in Antarctica is a big dead giveaway as far as I'm concerned. Plus the fact that you've got Apollo astronauts and patriarchs of Moscow and Luftwaffe Reichsmarschalls, everybody else associated with the place, that's reasonable.
And you also talk about the Versailles template of interstellar relations.
Yep.
And you talked about it in your Bastrop, Texas secret space program lecture.
Yep.
The cosmic Versailles. So explain to us a little bit about that.
Well, if you're going to have a cosmic war, I think World War I is the template for these people. And the reason I say that is people like Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, what were they? They were all advisors to President Wilson at Versailles. They helped draft this whole post-war settlement, which literally blew up in their faces. Thank you, Adolf Hitler. But, it wasn't terribly successful. What they were trying to do was, you have to remember, when Germany surrendered at the end of World War I, Germany itself had not been invaded. It was an economic defeat. It was a military defeat, but the country itself had not been invaded. The infrastructure was still there. And by infrastructure, I mean not only the industrial plant, but also the political infrastructure. They got rid of the Kaiser, but everything else stayed in place. So in other words, they hadn't really defeated Germany. It was simply a stalemate that they all just agreed to quit. Let's stop. And Versailles, if you look very carefully at it, tried to do was it tried to limit German production of certain types of armaments. No artillery beyond 50 centimeters caliber,
Yeah.
For good reason. The French had been on the receiving end of 16-inch cannon for 4 years. Road mobile, no less. they were trying to limit the production of armaments. They were trying to limit the size of the German military to 100,000 men. They were trying to limit the displacement of German capital ships to 10,000 tons, all of which was in the treaty. But the other thing that Versailles did was it demilitarized the Rhineland. In other words, the area west of the Rhine River had to be completely demilitarized with a beachhead, a bridgehead of about, I think, 30 kilometers on the east bank of the Rhine, also to be demilitarized. What they were trying to do was push any future German mobilization point back behind the Rhine River. In other words, about 100 miles further east than it was at the beginning of World War I, should another general mobilization occur. In the east, Clemenceau and the subsequent French leaders had done essentially the same thing to try and hem Germany in the east by creating alliances with the newly emerged states like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Romania. So in other words, they were trying to keep Germany encircled. So this was the Versailles template. If you look at the cosmic war that I talked about, let's assume that both sides fought themselves to exhaustion, just like they did in World War I. And let's use World War I as a template to go back and look at this cosmic war. You have the same situation there from my reading of those documents that I put in that book, of both sides fighting themselves to exhaustion. One side, the victors, inventory the vanquished technology and take some of it and destroy some of the rest of it. But if you read certain texts like Enoch, it also talks about a quarantine zone at the orbit of the moon, or depending on other versions, some of the outer planets, around the Earth. So in other words, you're looking at almost the same thing in terms of Earth in this cosmic war as you're looking at with Germany and Versailles. They're attempting to hedge in a potential enemy from ever breaking out and doing the same thing again. And, the lesson that, World War I was Germany came roaring back, even worse than it did in the First World War. And what are we doing now on Earth? Well, we're talking about going out and mining asteroids, weaponizing space, and so on and so forth. So I think there was a cosmic Versailles template operating in people's minds like Dulles and so on, who are the mandarins of this post-war breakaway state, looking at the same situation, thinking of UFOs. Oh, we might want to look at those ancient texts and maybe take them very seriously. Maybe we're dealing with that kind of situation. If we go out there and we don't make our intentions clear, we might be calling down the wrath of the French army, so to speak, and they're going to invade. So I think it's very interesting that the earliest space probes that go beyond the moon do what? They have all these little plaques. We come in peace for all mankind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hitler marching those regiments across the bridges at Cologne, well, I'm coming in peace. And the British, he's just invading his own country, To me, it's a fascinating parallel.
So, a year or two ago, what we were just talking about asteroids. You just talking about mining asteroids and stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, what's the deal? Have you looked into the Oumuamua asteroid? What's your thoughts on that, Joseph?
My thoughts are kind of like Hoagland's. This thing comes barreling in from out of nowhere, kind of unexpectedly. It's a very unusual asteroid. To me, it looks kind of like Rod of God stuff.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, it's deflected. And Hoagland points out that subsequent pictures of the asteroid have an area toward the front that is glowing in the infrared range of the spectrum. Nuclear hit. Take it out. Divert it.
And that was probably part of the secret space program that probably...
It may have been. Again, I wouldn't say probably. I'm simply entertaining the possibility that they may have. The other thing about Oumuamua to remember is the Chelyabinsk meteor. And the strange...
17.
No. This was very recently inside of Russia. You're thinking of Tunguska. Yeah, the Chelyabinsk meteor, a few years ago that flew over Chelyabinsk and then blew up. Well, a month prior to this is what people don't remember. A month prior to that, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, went on Russian TV warning about the dangers of asteroid strikes. And he went on to say, well, Russia would like to cooperate with the rest of the world in setting up a planetary asteroid defense system. But even if we can't get anybody else's cooperation, we should go ahead and build our own anyway. And, well, how are we going to take care of those asteroids, Prime Minister Medvedev? Well, he says, we can use our big thermonuclear weapons, to either blow these things up or divert their path, and other means.
What's the other means?
Yeah, bingo. What other means? Yeah, what are those other means, Prime Minister, that you have in mind?
Something they're keeping secret.
Something there, yes.
Possibly with this black budget money.
Yeah, rod of God technology, directed energy weapons, zap them out of existence. Who knows? But he said this. Then a month later, we get the Chelyabinsk meteor incident, which to me, coming as it does a month after those statements, is mighty peculiar. Then it blows up. Then Russian TV airs a bunch of video of something apparently following the Chelyabinsk meteor and perhaps destroying it. And then, of course, all of this happens about a year after an American and Russian satellite in orbit collided with each other. Remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, neither Russia nor America launches satellites with the deliberate intention of, having them collide with each other. So, it's looking to me like someone gave one of those two satellites a little push,
Yeah.
So I've always thought that the Chelyabinsk thing is mighty peculiar. If you've got the technology, again, going back to what I've said before, if you've got the technology that you can engineer the fabric of space-time, you can give those little things a nudge. In other words, you can start throwing things at each other.
It don't take much.
It don't take much if you've got the technology. So again, I'm suspicious of the Chelyabinsk thing for the reasons I've outlined with Prime Minister Medvedev's statements. I'm suspicious of the Oumuamua thing on the basis of that very peculiar infrared signature that all of a sudden is there, and then we don't hear any more about it. Oh, everybody can relax now. No problem. I'm suspicious.
So for this time, Joseph, to round things up, like I told you last night, I could talk to you for hours. But for sake of the viewers, we need to limit the video, because we could do this thing for 10, 20 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, over the next couple of years and stuff, we will get more on video, but so tell me, I know you don't like the term endgame. How about we use agenda?
Mm-hmm.
What is the agenda of the cabal? You could use the Illuminati, you could use the elite, for the secret space program, for this breakaway civilization. What is, give me your best. I know I'm asking you to speculate, but just give me what you think might take place in the future if they get their way. What is going to take place for humanity? What is going to happen with all of this? Is it going to be like what we were talking about last night with Mars? It's going to be another secret. There's going to be some type of depopulation.
I think they have a lot of end games, but to restrict it simply to space.
Okay.
And without going into details on this remark, I think a huge part of their agenda is religious in nature. And I don't want to go into that because we'll be here all day.
Yes.
But that said, with regard to space, I think that they are going to try and use space to impose in some fashion, to impose their global order top down, so to speak, because the bottom up approaches are collapsing. They're not getting them anywhere. This has to be done if they think there is any sort of potential threat to humanity out there. This has to be done. I think there's indicators that they're in a hurry to do this. And I think within that agenda, like all end games, you have several factions now that are vying for being in the position of being the dominant faction when it all comes down. So in other words, it's starting to fall apart because they're starting to fight each other. Predictable, typical human behavior. And they're trying to scramble to keep things tightly under control. I think eventually, within the next possibly 20 years, you're going to see some sort of technological announcements that's going to be the game changer. Because we're dealing with technologies, quite literally, that will put an absolute utter end to the idea of monetized debt functioning as money. Because the monetary system is always closely tied to your energy system and to your physics. And when the energy system and physics is based on a closed system of non-renewable resources, so we've been told, that's another canard. When that happens, you're dealing with a closed economic system. When you're dealing with a technology, on the other hand, that can access literally the 0-point energy, this will change the financial picture completely. And they know this. They stand to lose a lot of power. And this is the other reason that they have to have a global surveillance network in place so that they can keep their hands on that financial power. This is the reason I think that ultimately is behind the emergence of cryptocurrencies and having everything, in the cloud. This is their way of keeping a hold of that system and not allowing it to fall into the wrong hands, which, I think their hands are the wrong hands too.
And that is very well said. And how would you want to leave off for this conversation? The floor is yours. Do you think that we will be victorious in this war, the human species, against the evil nature, the evil cabal, elite, whatever you want to call it?
Yes, I do.
And what message would you want to leave off for the audience?
Well, I do think we'll be victorious, but not without a lot of bumpy areas. You're dealing, in my opinion, with a very desperate and evil group of people that have been running things very badly for a very long time. But I'm always of the view, and I've always been of the view, that built into the universe is a moral fabric, and you cannot act outside that for too long without the rubber band snapping you back into place. And we've stretched that rubber band just about as far as it's going to be stretched, and we're watching it begin to snap back. But it's not, it's going to be very, very bumpy, and it could get very, very ugly before that happens. But in the end, I think these people are they've set themselves up for their own defeat.
Joseph, thank you very much.
Yep.
It was an honor.
Yep. Thank you.
We will definitely touch on things that we left out and other works that are coming down the road for you. I know you are a very busy man. And like I said, it's an honor and privilege. And you are the myth, the legend. You are the cosmic Indiana Jones. Thank you very much. And I'll meet you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.